Hey there, folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Interviews. I'm Arlyeon, and we're here today with Adrian Bauer of DPad Studio. I said that right?
Right.
Yeah, who you may know as one of the folks who developed OwlBoy. Care to add anything to that intro?
Yeah, I do a lot of level design, general design, but since we're a small team, we all kind of have our hands in something, like in pretty much everything. But yeah, I generally just kind of worked on a lot of things, not the art and sound directly or the programming. Yeah, I did what I did.
Fair enough. So, to kickstart most of our interviews, dare say pretty much all of them, we like to find out a bit more about the people themselves, about the devs, beyond just what they're working on. So, in that regards, what's your favorite game, and what have you been recently diving into?
Favorite game is a bit of a toughie because I've played quite a lot of stuff. I like a lot of games for different aspects, and favorites tend to fall out of favor. But I still have like memories of them being my favorite for particular time periods. So I'll get back to that one. But I think what I've been playing recently has been Breath of the Wild and Mario Galaxy. I've been really enjoying just the incentive, or like the way that the game is. Um, Generally, it's incentivizing your curiosity. It's the tasks are almost always to do with what's behind that thing, what's over there. That thing looks out of place, or that looks like a pattern. It's just really interesting how they've gone about just pushing the player and letting the player set their own goals. I've just found it really fascinating. I haven't finished Breath of the Wild. I kind of got to this point where I had seen pretty much every inch of it, and I got to the castle and I just kind of stopped playing. I got really busy, but I just kind of felt like I was done. But I like almost 100%ed Mario Universe or Odyssey Mario Universe. Um, but yeah,
I'll admit I have not dived into either of those, though my familiarity with Breath of the Wild is a friend telling me I got to the castle, and I was like, oh, that's near the start of the game, and then all my weapons broke, and I was like, oh.
yeah, it's. I'm not a fan of the weapon breaking. I think they could have done things a little bit better. There's the problem I have with it is that there are situations where you'll go into most of the dungeons or whatever are very short little trials, but once in a while they'll do a longer one, and you'll end up with tools that you don't need or you don't have, like you don't have enough arrows or you don't have any fire arrows or so on. And it's cool that they're short enough that you can like just exit and come back. But there are times where you'll just break the one weapon you need at the very end of like a trial, and it's just like cool. I'll come back here whenever I care to. For the most part, it's pretty balanced, and you'll just pick up stuff and you'll trash it, and you'll just keep going. And so long as you're kind of okay with the idea of just destroying weapons that you don't really need, it's not so bad. But it is kind of frustrating in just how it sets up a lot of situations later. But I guess it also depends on how many things you've found and where you're keeping track of everything. I think a big problem is that like the loading times. Say you need a bunch of hammers, you can always warp back to get hammers in like a specific location, but it's boring and time consuming to load, go to that town, go to the very end of that town, pick up the hammer, then go back to where you need to be, and it just kind of interrupts the flow of everything. It's stuff like that that isn't major.
So there's a bunch of tedium basically built into the game design.
Yeah, it it's tedium if you're not planning ahead and being a hoarder. It's tedium if you get caught by a certain situation. It's just kind of weird how it's not a consistent thing. It just yeah. But I really like everything else about it. It's just a fantastic game.
So, sort of jumping off from this, what exactly got you into game development, and just was it something you always wanted to do?
Yeah, I've been kind of working on games since I was a little kid. I started with a program called Click and Play in like 1996. Before that, I kind of tinkered with Visual Basic and some other game maker programs that would come in magazines that were for like DOS and Windows 95. I just really enjoyed it. It was just a thing that captivated my attention and just all of my focus. I found a lot of aspects of game design to be interesting. It just because it encompasses so many professions, I guess. It just kind of spoke to me because I like to do multiple things. I like to I generally just like to be curious about everything and be a voracious reader. But yeah, I just kind of followed down that, and somewhere around the early 2000s, it didn't really seem like making games as an indie would sort of be ever a thing. So I kind of dropped off a little bit for a couple years, but still kind of like had my hand in it, and just yeah, then DPad started up with some friends, and we just kind of here we are now.
Which, actually, speaking of that, how did you meet the other members of DPad Studio?
So way back, I was working with one of the original programmers, and Jonathan, and we were working on an RPG that was going nowhere, but it was cool to work on a JRPG in the early 2000s. And Simon joined in because he really liked what we were working on, and he started doing art. We just kept going on it. And then Blake, our original programmer, he left after just kind of laying the groundwork for the engine and the prototype. Then Joe Remy, Simon and Joe Remy met each other at a party, and Joe was actually on his way to work at Lionhead in the UK, and was just kind of blown away by this OwlBoy prototype. Ditched all that and came to like work with us, and then along the way, Simon's brother Henrik, he joined in. He just started programming with us. He just thought it was cool, and yeah, we just kind of stuck with that. And about 7 years later, here we are. So we all just kind of like found each other through quality of work, and turned out we enjoy working with each other.
That definitely does help.
Yep.
So, what sort of skills has game development and the creation of OwlBoy required you to put to use, and where did you develop those skills?
Some of it was writing. I I finished off my bachelor's of English and sociology while developing OwlBoy, mostly because I enjoy it. That sort of like it's not so much the reading and writing. Well, I mean, it's the quality of reading and writing you get from being in an academic setting, but it's also to do with the critical thinking and just everything about structuring your arguments and drilling into like the root of whatever you're trying to write and so on. It's very good in it's it's hard to describe because English as a major is something that people don't really understand unless they're really into it. And it's a lot of project and business stuff, actually. It's a lot of communication. It's about understanding what you're trying to say, what other people are trying to say. It's about communicating. Well, I mean, it's about conveying the right thoughts and feelings while you're writing. It's it's a lot of things to do with. I mean, it's the root of like my communication. It's the analysis, everything that I'm doing right now, um, and that helped a lot. I also have a background in just tech and other things, so I have a bit of light programming knowledge. I'm not a like heavily invested programmer, but I can help out and I can learn. I was not that useful for as a programmer, more as just helping like Henrik and Joe do research for any tools they need, just upcoming things like interesting stuff that they can add to the engine and so on, like compression and stuff like that. Just having an understanding of that tech stuff and being able to talk to them and being able to talk to Jonathan. Like I'm not a musician at all, but I understand the technical aspects of like the computer technical aspects of music and sound. So I can talk to Jonathan about that. I can talk to him about the audio side and then talk to the programmers about the audio stuff in a way that like Jonathan. So it helps communicate that way, and it's the same thing with like art. I understand like the technical part of art that needs to go into the engine and so on, so I can help Simon, make sure that his stuff fits and works in the game and is optimized, and I can do any editing that needs to be done for Henrik. So it's just a bit of everything. It's game development. Like, you need to wear a lot of hats, especially when you're in a small team.
So, actually, sort of continuing on that then, so how did OwlBoy come to be?
When we were working on that kind of failed RPG, Simon had a bunch of ideas for just a flying platformer game. He went through a bunch of revisions for characters and such, and he just kind of he pitched everything he had to Blake, and Blake started mocking up kind of a crude demo. We just had this character flying around doing things. We just kind of worked off of his notes and whatever Simon was working on, like, or had completed for art assets. Jonathan had done some music. We had to reconnect with them because at the time we weren't actually directly communicating with Jonathan, and it was like, does John really want to work with us? I don't know. And I reached out to him. Turns out he was super excited to find out the project was still going. But it just kind of like started off like that, and eventually we just kind of we put out a demo, like a really early crappy demo, and we got a lot of feedback on what we were doing wrong and right. After a while, we completely redid everything when Joe and Henrik were around, and kind of figured out what we wanted to make with it. But the origins are just a lot of like iteration and prototyping and so on.
Fair enough. So, having gone through the game fairly thoroughly, I should hope at least, I can't help but be curious as to what led to the decision of making Otis mute. I mean, there's like a long-running tradition for a lot of games of making like a mute protagonist to be used as like a self-insert, but there was a lot of work placed into ensuring that he actually did convey emotions and personality and didn't come off as a blank slate. So, was it a literary or design choice or a bit of both that led to that decision?
It was a bit of everything. In some aspects, we wanted to have the silent protagonist because it just kind of had the right feel for like the era of gaming that we were kind of reaching for. But we were totally aware of its shortcomings as a protagonist, as a point of empathy and sympathy, and just how boring a lot of silent protagonists really are. Generally, it's like your actions and your thoughts are the silent protagonist. Like, that's kind of weak because you still can't control the character for all key things. What kind of changed along the way, though, is we had a lot of animations for Otis's expressions. Simon put a ton of work in all of those animations, but we weren't really utilizing them properly. So one of the things I did is I went through all of the events, and every time that Otis should be either directly expressing himself or kind of like in the background, he should be just using those animations. It's like he should be reacting to other people's dialogue to just do anything other than just stand there like a idiot. um, and so it became like after that sort of rolling, we started to really just look at every scene and make sure that everyone emoted. And we, in some cases, had situations where the focus of the scene is a different character, but having Otis still nod and do things as if he was a part of the conversation were kind of subtle. And if you're paying attention to Otis, then you'll see him kind of at least trying to interact. And I think that paid off. Well, it paid off in the end because a lot of people noticed it, especially maybe on their first play, maybe second. But it was a detail that I'm really proud of.
I love his surprised expressions.
Yeah, everyone loves that face.
Like literally have a clip of just him making like the in shock surprised expression because it's perfect. But likewise, and sort of building on this, he's also not quite a typical protagonist. There's like more than one instance where he's placed in situations where he's locked up in fear or vulnerable, and like in the intro even, there's those distinct moments where he has that sort of anxiety, was literally like how he looked at it when it happened.
Right.
And he does display like courageous. He's noted as being courageous, but he's not this infallible, perfect hero. And I was curious if he evolved to be this way personality-wise over the course of development, and or if this was always sort of intended, and what inspired you to create such an interesting change from just sort of the norms that have been set up for protagonists.
Right. So Otis was always kind of set up to be a bit of a weakling. I think a big part of it was that whatever he was trying to do, like as a character, we weren't really capitalizing as much as we wanted to originally on just the premise of Otis being kind of weak and in need of other people and having like emotional baggage and so on. How it kind of went is that we started with that premise, and I guess the integration of it came as we developed the game and as we kind of went back to other scenes and said, hey, that's not right, or that doesn't feel right. So, for example, having the gunners as your only means of basically attacking and doing anything, they're your key to the world. It made Otis mechanically and like not just story-wise. I mean, you can say, oh, Otis is dependent on his friends and everyone needs each other, but you have to have that mechanically enforced within the gameplay. So that's why we have them. You pretty much have to have the gunner with you. Originally, we had Otis where he could do a spin attack and he would do a little bit of damage, but then it's like, you don't really need anyone then. You can just kind of go around and brute force your way through the game with just Otis. But when you absolutely depend on your gunners and your buddies, it creates that kind of bond over the course of a game, and it just kind of shows how dependent you are and how codependent you are as you kind of like have that, taken away from you, like in the last areas and so on. Spoilers. You don't have it taken away from you, but like, it's just one of those things you take for granted. A lot of it has just been in the details of actually implementing it through gameplay and then rewriting scenes to be aware of what we are trying to establish and so on. Trying not to reach too far or too little with situations. It's kind of like when there's cutscenes and the cutscene does something that you normally wouldn't do or can't do. That's bizarre and jarring. And we try to avoid all situations that would really just like undermine anything that we've written and undermine anything we've done mechanically with the game.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of an exception to that rule I noticed, but to get that required very thoroughly picking over every single coin in the game to get that cape. And then some. I managed to, they commented that I had more coins than there was even supposed to be in the game.
Yeah, there's a small glitch, whatever. Yeah, we kind of added in a few fixes to get around that.
I take it it's like if you open a chest is like the last thing you do to get coins or something?
Yeah, it's something like that, and there was a couple of small changes made later in the game that didn't account for maximum amounts, and it's just the management of coins was a little bit flubbed, so whoops.
It's fine. I mean, it just means it's slightly forgiving if someone misses something.
Yeah.
But yeah, no. So that's sort of interesting then. That I guess then the cape is sort of a carryover from that original design. Then, correct?
Yeah. Like he's always had the cape. He's always had that going on, but we never really defined character rules as well. We started with this idea, oh, it's got gunners and pew pew pew, and you've got your cape and you do this, an action game, cool, blah blah blah. But then it's like, oh wait, but we had this character we were writing and we had these other characters, and this just kind of doesn't jive with what we were writing, and we can still keep this gameplay. We just need to reframe it in a way that makes everything seem appropriate. And that's kind of the biggest thing about game design is sometimes you could have the same old thing as any other game, but if you framed it in the right way, then it feels interesting, or it feels like it belongs to a game. That's just one of those subtle things.
Also, I just really enjoyed that final upgrade for dashing everywhere like top speed.
Oh, yeah.
But on the subject of characters, were there always 3 companions, or were there more once upon a time? And how have they evolved over the course of, I suppose, development?
So originally there were going to be 4. Cornell, the scientist, was going to be with you. She would throw these like flying bombs and do other crazy stuff. She turned out to be incredibly like too powerful and broke everything in the game. And then we had a problem with it just not having content that would match that and make her an interesting character. It just became more of a, hey, here's just another character, but with a better weapon. And that was one of the key things that we figured out partway into development, is that as we added these gunners, we found that like Alphonse, for example, was just a better version of Getty. So why would you ever use Getty? And then like Twig was way more powerful than all the other ones. So it's like, why even bother using any of the other ones? And then it becomes this problem of like forcing players to use a gunner for a certain thing that they don't really want to, instead of having some sort of like not just mechanical but like any sort of emotional reason to use a particular character. It's just diversifying. Well, not just diversifying, but it's giving everyone a unique purpose on the team, and then creating things around that, creating situations around that, so they're not just a big mush of your weapon. It's like, why bother using the like in any like run and gun game, it's like, why bother using like the basic gun when you can get the spread shot or this shot or whatever. It makes, what ends up happening is that when you make, say, the basic gun, which would be like Getty, kind of like not useful or always kind of at a disadvantage to the other ones, there's no reason to ever use Getty, because it's like the boring, plain old weapon that doesn't do anything and eventually becomes kind of obsolete, or cumbersome, or time consuming, and so on. That that kind of plays its role into just kind of testing and going through and making sure that every character is kind of balanced, so on.
Yeah, because like there's enemies that Twig can't. Slight spoilers there. You can use Twig as a character. Twig can deal with some characters fairly well, but just due to the nature of the way he attacks, there's plenty of characters that you'd still need to deal with, either Getty or God damn it, I can't remember the Alphonse's weapon. And like Alphonse's weapon just hits like a freaking train, but the cooldown on it means you're going to be swapping back to Getty. So, I mean, design-wise, like, the decision there makes a lot of sense, because otherwise, like, the only thing I could have seen that would have really balanced it out would have been if Cornell had been, like, a dot of some sort, because that would have made her useful for swapping and reapplying during boss fights, but for normal enemies, you probably wouldn't.
Yeah, and the other thing is that when you get into more characters and more guns and more tools, then you need to design levels around them. And it becomes overly complicated in some cases. It adds work in the sense that we have only so much time to get this thing done. I know we took a really long time, but like, you have deadlines and you can't just keep revising things and going through and adding content that needs to be tested and played and to make sure that it's even fun. Like, you can make content for all of these characters and go through all of that, but is it any good? You can, like, I've made mountains of content for OwlBoy, but like, is all of it good? No. Like, there's a lot of crap because there's some things that I'm just learning as I go, and then I find out, it's all right. This is just filler or whatever, and it's just like, no, we would rather just take the good stuff and dump the filler, and especially the crap. Just we're always learning as you make.
Also, though, I do appreciate Cornell's laugh. Like, that moment was great.
Oh yeah.
So, I actually, tying into the characters and the like, though, I found it fairly notable that the campfire conversations are easy enough to miss, I suppose, for someone just to rush through the game. Were they always an optional detail for players to find, or had you explored other options to further characterize the companion characters and just the world at large?
We made them optional. We made a lot of things optional because we kind of like for the core story, the core gameplay, and all of that. That like making the important bits like make sure you always run into the important bits, and that kind of keeps the pacing good, like in a good place. It keeps the flow good. Anytime you're asking a player to go through excessive reading, or because I mean the campfires are just reading, they're not gameplay, they're not action gameplay, they're not a part of that core loop of like flying and shooting and flying and whatever treasure. If you're going to ask someone to sit there and read a bunch of stuff or stop the game completely, you should let the player do it on their own time. Like, let them choose, yeah, you know what, I need a break, or whatever, or something. Like, in many cases, optional content, or like in general pacing, the more control you can give to the player, the better. In some, like, it depends on really what you're trying to do. Like, if the story is going at a certain pace, I mean, you really don't want the player to go dick around while there's an important thing coming down in the next 30 seconds, blah blah blah. But if it's in this kind of in between phase of like important events, you should let the player kind of take their time. And I think the other thing is that having optional content like that and encouraging people to just take their time, it has more to say about details in the world, where if you're allowed to slow down and just pay attention to things, then maybe you're not going to rush through every little area. Maybe you'll pay attention to some of the small things I put into like the level design and so on. It gives you time to just kind of talk to NPCs, because there's a lot of stuff that's done, like there's a lot of storytelling that's done through the environment, and hopefully at a glance it gets across what it needs to, like the most important things. But if you were to stop and take a look, then you'll get the details of it, and it's just there for people who that's their style of play.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it. I personally got sort of a vibe of like it's like an older RPG, but like Grandia, the first one, because there was like these campfire modes where you talk and you got to get these just chunks of optional bits of story and characterization. So I really liked learning more about the world at large. I also liked that if I was done and just like exhausted of reading or whatever, it gave me the immediate option of backing out and not having my hand basically be held and forced through like long exposition sequences. So I mean, I appreciate it quite a bit. With that said, though, what is your favorite NPC out of like the various OwlBoy ones, and are there any specific defining moments for you?
My favorite NPC is Nubby. So the Bogwins all have names: Yubby, Gubby, Nubby, and Bubby. Nubby is the one who is in the shop. And...
Oh, that poor Bogwin.
Oh, that's not a poor Bogwin. I'll just like leave that at that. But there were some interesting things that I had put into the game that you can still access if you can get out of bounds. But Nubby was probably my favorite NPC. Just such a I don't know. I don't want to get into it. Nubby was just kind of like a strange outside character. I don't think I really got all of that information across in the dialogue though. But there's some hints of it still there. Sorry, I'm being vague on that one because I don't know if I'll ever explain everything to do with the Bogwins.
Nah, is that like there's... You know what, I'll address that in a later question, man. I personally enjoyed Twig a lot. Especially for, like, I guess the reveal a bit on, like, his accoutrement. I thought that was hilarious. There were, like, a few defining moments, but, like, for him, I really enjoyed just, like, a bit of his naivety. Like, he was really out of his depths, even as far as, like, a lot of the other protagonists was. So he came off as, like, sort of naive and easygoing, and like did not realize like the depths of what he was into. So then the conflict at, I believe it's the Hex Machine. Yeah, that was interesting for me. just that initial part of like like where it all starts to dawn on him, which also I enjoyed Dirk actually, despite the fact that he's a jerk. Diving into the more technical side of things, just what was the hardest challenge when making this game, both for you and also for the team at large?
The scale, like the absolute scope of this game, was the hardest part of it, because even though we kind of kept it simple, we had so much stuff to do, and it was just a matter of getting up, doing as many things as we could in a day, trying to sleep, doing it again every day, and then not burning out. I mean, for everyone, they all had their own tasks. Like Simon had all of the artwork to do, every single pixel in that game. I had every single map to design and every single map to redesign and rework and so on. Joe and Henrik had all of the programming to do. Jonathan all the music to do and all the sound design. And when possible, we would help out little bits here and there with implementation. I think the most time-consuming part of level design was just the sheer amount of revisions. I would go through an area and I would make it as good as I could make it, given the assets I had at the time, given the direction that we wanted to take a scene, and what gameplay I could do given the tools I had. So I didn't always have the most flexible tools in the map editor for setting up gameplay situations, timing of events and scripting and all of that. And it improved over time. We always improved our tools and other things, our workflow. And then I would get new assets and so on. And so I would come back to these areas that it's like, oh, I can do palette swapping now, or I can do rotation and cropping and so on. So I could use a bunch of assets, or I'd have a whole bunch of new assets from Simon, and I could finally make an area look like what I envisioned it could be, and so on. So it would, visually it would take time to do that, but then there would be making sure that there was room for gameplay, making sure I wasn't going like making it too pretty so I wouldn't so the player wouldn't be able to focus on anything, or that the space itself was designed to look good instead of actually playing well and feeling good when you're exploring and so on. All these little details that are just constant revision and constant reworking and replaying, and then you put your work down, you leave it for a week, and you come back to it later and go, this was garbage, what was I thinking? Or it's like, that's not so bad, or whatever. And sometimes it's like I'll put something aside and be like, I'm done with this. I don't think it's great, whatever. And someone else will play through the game. They'll be like, when did you do this? This is amazing. And it'll inspire them, like it'll inspire Joe to set up some interesting gameplay for that area. And so it all just kind of like works out in these weird overlapping, like, you do something, you move on, and so on. And it's so you never really and then the biggest problem is knowing when to stop. When is enough enough? When is it pretty enough? When does it play well enough? When you should just leave it alone? And you get to that point. Anyone working as a professional, like artist or any writer or so on, when your skills and your ability has kind of like reached, when you're on par with what you think you can do and what you can do and what you've actually accomplished. When all of that is kind of like at a satisfactory equilibrium, then you're done, and that there's nothing else to nitpick. And this is a problem when you've worked on something for a very long time, is that you always improve, you always learn something new, you always get a fresh perspective on like a higher bar for quality, knowing that for every area, that even if it's an old thing you've done, it's good enough, and not just good enough, but it's like the best that is required for that situation, and then just calling it quits and moving on.
So, okay, so first off, is there specific features that you're particularly just satisfied with having now, like, with the game's release?
I think I'm pretty satisfied with everything that I've got in there. I mean, the month after launch, I was watching pretty much every single stream, every YouTube, whatever I could get my eyes on, and all the feedback I'd get from support emails and so on the forum. And I would make adjustments to my levels based on what I saw people doing. I saw one person get caught by a hidden ledge, and it's like, oh yeah, I should move that, and make this more clear, or remove this and that. This is distracting, or so on. That was like to do with the fine tuning when it's out in the wild, because you can only do so much with playtesting. But I'm pretty satisfied with everything I've done. Of course, there's things I probably could change, but I'm done. I'm okay with it.
So, is there anything that didn't make into the game that you really wanted in there?
Yeah, I had these extra dungeons. The areas that you get the coins.
The golden discs?
Yeah. I swap between like internal names and what they actually were listed or whatever. Kind of like calling things Dungeon 1 or Dungeon 2 or Jungle Dungeon and so on. It's just like it makes no sense to anyone else, but I've been calling it that for like 10 years. So I'm going to keep doing it. Those discs, originally there was a gate that would open up and it would take you to a special, like basically a huge challenge dungeon. And I had four of them, and they were all pretty comprehensive. They were about the size, if not bigger, than the dungeons that were in the main game. And they were just purely there to challenge people who had learned how to play the game, wanted to see like lore and other little interesting things just that weren't a part of like the main game. I really enjoyed designing them. I hated revising them so much. I really would have liked to have had them in there, because we also, part of it was recycling content that we couldn't make room for in the main game. So anything that just didn't fit, wasn't fun, and had to go for the sake of completion or quality control, I had reworked and reused. And like the Nubby thing, I had a whole scene with like Nubby in one of these dungeons that kind of shows his true nature, and that was just like a really fun scene to like a whole thing to script out with Henrik. Too bad it didn't make it in, but and then we had other things like we had this idea of like a mega dungeon that connected all of the areas, kind of like a background layer to everything in the world. We had a bunch of other things. I'm I'm okay with those not actually making a game. There's a lot of content that would have been cool but didn't work thematically. Say for example, fighting.
Pirate boss?
Yes, I don't know why I'm blanking
Monstrum?
on this. Yes,
Is that his name,
because all
Monstrum?
it's Molstrom.
Molstrom. I was
I'm just
close.
thinking of the voice actor, Mick Lauer. I'm just kind of like you're Molstrom now, because he did a couple of grunts and screams for him. But like Molstrom, you could fight Molstrom, but the thing is, Molstrom is this monster, like this unstoppable force. How stupid is it if this little owl kid can just go and like beat the crap out of him with his friends and run away? Like, how does that, like, that completely undermines his like thematic presence and his power within the game for you to just be able to knock him over even just once. It's like you put that like chink in the armor. You do that, and the player will never forget it. They'll never actually be a dangerous force, or threatening force at all. So stuff like that, I'm totally fine with like getting rid of. Even if there are solutions to that, they're not great, and they also kind of interrupt the flow of everything. It's better, I think. How we left it, it's fine. We left it in the best shape that we could, and the extra content, we took what we could and we reworked it into the game. Like all of the lore and other things that were in those extra dungeons, we compressed that, we rewrote it, and we put it into the final area that you can get into after you've got all those discs.
Yeah, I'm going to be touching on that in a few. But what was it like to design levels with the player able to move as freely as they can within the confines of the game? Like, originally with the tutorial, I'd expected a lot more limitations, and then I got into the main game, I could just, like, freely run around, fly around. Like, did all that vertical spacing require a different mindset?
It did. There were a number of things that were just like when you start out working on this, you have ideas and models of how a lot of gameplay works, and you start kind of setting up situations around those. And then you start to think, oh, wait, this doesn't, a platforming situation doesn't matter. And if I were to try and force someone to do platforming, I'm not making them fly. Everything should be flying. And then writing, uh, making situations for that. So, like,
The waterfalls?
yeah, the waterfalls are a way of like naturally canceling out flight. And then it's like, well, do I want to force people to do things that they're not going to do very often? So platforming shouldn't be that intensive. It shouldn't be like later in the game. You shouldn't be punished for never platforming, never having played a platformer. You should just, like that's part of the difficulty curve. But just a lot of everything in OwlBoy was line of sight and anything to do with layering. So if you can see something with your gunner, you can probably point your gun at them and shoot them, and that can be around a corner, that can be like ducking down just enough to get Getty in the way to fire off a round. Um, there's a lot of geometry involved, and choosing when to make the environment like complex and simple and so on a big task. Making sure that you're understanding that your interactions with enemies are always going to be that line of sight. So like if you're always kind of flying, you should be able to get around them the angle. Are there going to be weak points on them you should expose? Are there going to be defenses that you need to rip off because Otis has that grab account and the spin it mechanic and so on, and the different things. Like every enemy has to be based on basically any vector. You can attack from any direction, and you have these tools to use. So everything, in a way, enemies are designed around the tools that you have and the shortcomings, and being mindful of the shortcomings of the tool set.
Like those stupid freaking fire drakes. Okay. So I'm gonna say, like, I was really impressed by a lot of the subtle touches in the game. I'd mentioned things like Otis's expressions and also the overall aesthetic, but one thing that I noticed a fair amount, especially while doing Flight of the Bogwins, I'm also going to address that later, was the day and night system.
Right.
Was that always meant to just be an aesthetic touch, or did it ever actually influence things?
It was mostly an aesthetic thing, but we were planning on other things just attached to it, just minor stuff though. Mostly because it just makes the world feel like it's moving. It when you don't have like of day and so on, and you have a static sunlight and so on. We were going to try and integrate it more into the pacing of the game visually, like, but we just didn't have time to change a bunch of tools. So, for example, when you're leaving town, it's you're getting like when you're leaving town, it's super early in the morning, so everything is a little bit orange and so on. And then day breaks as you get up to the first tower. We were going to do things like when you leave, like say when you leave a dungeon, it would be nighttime, or it would be a certain time of day getting close to nighttime, and that would convey the sense of pacing to the player. How long have I been in this dungeon? You may not have actually been in there very long, but in the player's mind or in the game itself, in the context of the game, it would be a full day of adventuring and battling and so on. And that's something I actually kind of wish I had been able to get into the game, but like it doesn't really matter. It's just a subtle touch that would have been interesting, would have nicely conveyed a couple of things, but they weren't required.
So, OwlBoy is a pretty expansive game, yet you never actually provide players with a map, despite that the in-game reference that the owls were historically tasked with making them.
Right.
Was that more of a nod to players needing to be diligent and that they weren't going to get a fancy technical shortcut, or was a mapping system intended at one point?
It was a bit of a nod to that. First of all, not having a map means that every single area should always convey direction and flow, and where you're coming from and where you're going should always have some kind of clear visual or thematic connection. You should never go through a door on the right and then suddenly be going up. And a lot of everything to do in the game is that I kept a clear map of how every level was structured and where it went in the game, so that anytime you're going somewhere, it's not that difficult to remember, oh yeah, I went down to get here or whatever. You should always, like, it was always just kind of set up that way to be a little bit linear where it needed to be and a little more expansive where it could be, but always very clear as to where something related to something else. And that just kind of, like, I think for the most part negated the need for a map. There are still people who absolutely need maps. Everyone's different, you know, but I don't think that it was a deal breaker because of the, like, clear organization of everything in the game and the way that the game is pointing in the right direction and so on, and using landmark to just kind of guide your eye and to guide, and like good barriers, early gating, and so on. So like early gating would be like you can't go through this area without, you know, a power up or something like that, like burning dry vine.
Without Alphonse, yeah.
Yeah. Or, you know, you need twig to get at waterfalls and so on, and making sure that you're not wasting people's time by sending them on a path that they can't do anything with. Like, because it's cool to go down a dead end, but at the same time, it's kind of a piss off, like, to have your time wasted.
Unless there's something at the end of that dead end.
Yeah, and
which, I mean, you'd rewarded a few times with there'd be like a little secret at like a dead end,
right,
where there'd be like a treasure in a nook.
Right. So I mean, it's a mix of things, and sometimes it's just refreshing to have it. It's all about what you've set up, what kind of what dialogue you've established to the player as to, like, exploration, because you don't want people to be told, oh yeah, you should go explore, it's super fun to explore, and then give them nothing to explore or to punish them for exploration. That's when it just becomes frustrating, and you develop that negative response from the player over time. It just becomes a thing where they don't want to explore, they don't want to see what the maps have. But yeah, that's kind of way off. But still, we were working on a small map upgrade because the maps themselves were finally completely finalized, but it never really became a priority. It never was really something we absolutely had to do. It was a convenience feature that we kind of tinkered with.
I'll admit, like, I have a horrible, horrible memory, and I managed to get to the game enough to, you know, get the friggin' owl cave. So it's set up in such a way that even someone with like the memory of like a sieve is fine. So I mean, thumbs up there.
I have a friend who is terrible at maps, terrible at direction, and he was able to get through. Like, he cannot. He probably would say that he can't find his way out of a wet paper bag. I don't think it's that bad, but yeah, he had trouble with direction, and he had no problem getting through OwlBoy.
But to redirect to the narrative questions, there's actually a number of poignant and sort of optional but altogether melancholy moments, which I'm going to try and be sort of vague about just to avoid spoilers. But there's a secret involving a seashell, there's a chest in Messos, I think, Icy Hell place, yeah. And I was curious what led to the inclusion of those particular moments of world building.
In a lot of ways, it's because the main story is generally kind of like a bit of an upbeat, positive adventure, and it's more fun to be caught up in the energy of, like, just an active story. Having more melancholy things as optional content, it's surprising. It's all relevant, like, in terms of like how it contrasts to the main story and what the primary aspects of the game are. It's going out of your way to kind of to learn more things. I think it gives more of an adult, not like an adult as in like
mature sort of look at the world as a whole.
Yeah, it gives complexity to characters, to have not just be like, oh, sad for the sake of sadness, and like that the indie game trope of always being sad. everything is sad in indie games. Everything is happy until it becomes extremely sad, and then everyone dies and so on. We wanted to just shy away from that as much as possible. Well, we still have like depressing things, but I think dealing with it better instead of it just tacking it on for like an emotional shock. We wanted to try and just to make it as complex, not complex and obscure or opaque as possible, but just give some details to characters that wouldn't otherwise be there, and maybe reframes how you interact with them or see them the next time. So on, because nothing really changes with the characters in some cases, but like say you play it over again, you know more about specific characters, and maybe it fills in their motivation and their thoughts that are they're partially expressed, the way that they talk and the way that they act and so on.
So I sort of enjoyed the bit of, I felt like it was a misdirection in regards to the significance and the meaning of the game's title. So without trying to spoil anything, was that always just sort of a part of the game's narrative and in intention with the title?
Yeah, that was one of the secrets we wanted to kind of keep until the end. I think it plays to more of partly the title itself. It sounds right for the era. Not that we're trying to make like a retro game on purpose, but it fits that kind of mood and that theme of like Super Nintendo, PlayStation era platformers and so on, of just having like something boy or something man or Wonder Woman or whatever. It has a nice ring to it, but it does kind of help in that sort of like rethinking what the title means when you get to the end, your role in and so on, like your role as a protagonist. In writing, you tend to have this like, is a character trustworthy, and can you believe everything they're saying to you? Can you believe everything that's being told to you by the narrator, let alone like the characters in the story? And it's not to be like deceptive for any malicious reason, but I think that toying with that at least gives a little bit more to game instead of just being like a throwaway title. It gives more of an interaction with the player or the reader, player, whatnot, outside of just the game itself. And I think a lot of that is important in games, or at least in media in general, is to leave people with something that is outside of the game, outside of the thing that they've just been interacting with. Get them to think about it when they've turned it off, when they shut it down, or so on. And have them carry their own thoughts and have their own questions to answer in recollection after the fact, when the game is done, when the title credit has ended, or when they're just on a break.
Yeah, like I thought it made for like a decent dramatic unveil, and like also just a nice play on like the habitual title drop trope that appears in so many games. So this is more of a personal thing, but which one of you folks was responsible for the cannon ride? Because like I just want you to let you know.
That's Joe.
The game briefly became like Owl Souls Prepare to Dive. Because like I think it took me 50 minutes of just dying over and over again. And was there originally meant to be more sort of mini game-ish sections in OwlBoy, or is it?
Yeah, we had ideas for all sorts of like mini games because, mini games are cool because at least it's not what you're currently doing. I like it when mini games are an extension of what you are already doing. Like, say you learn how to control the main game, and then trying to do a mini game, or some sort of exception to the rule, using what you've already learned how to do. So in a way, it was a bit probably jarring for people to not be flying in the way that they've been flying, and but it still goes with that theme of flying and gliding and so on. It just kind of it spins it around, and for a lot of people, it's like, well, if you're invested in the game and you're invested, like just in general, then it's like this is just something different to kind of, well, this is what you think. You think you're good at flying, you think you're good at this, then it just kind of gets spun around on them. So it's a bit mean. I'm not gonna lie, it's a bit mean,
Yeah.
but it is also it's within the same like confines of flying and giving the player something unexpected. And if it's their jam, then yeah, they will go at it and try it again and again, to master that other aspect of the game. It's all about like the context of it. It's like, are you going to be the master of flying in this game? Then yeah, you got to master this. And it was made a lot easier, I'll tell you that. God damn it.
God.
Joe made a really mean game. Like we made a really mean game for flying. It was like there are so many situations where I was barely keeping up with the things that Joe and Henrik were doing, and it's just like, you guys need to tone this shit down. And I would make changes to the level to make it a little bit easier here and there, but like it like that doesn't mean it's fun. Like it can be like mean and hard or whatever, but doesn't mean it's like a good experience. And it can turn people off.
There's a reason my audio is muted during that little recording of me just doing that. Yep.
This is a Christian stream.
I'm pretty sure I don't want to deal with YouTube just demonetizing my entire channel for like how much I curse. Cause I mean, yeah, no, it was just a lot of swearing. Cause it's like 40 or 50 minutes of straight just me like dying, which is gonna get condensed. Like,
yeah.
But yeah. So lastly, for just narrative notes, in your own head, do you feel OwlBoy's ending was bittersweet or ended on a more hopeful note, at least for the protagonist, if we take into account Nocte's words? Not baiting people to go looking for what those are or anything at all there pertaining to the golden discs. Nope.
I don't think I want to answer that one. I'm sorry. But I do kind of have some thoughts on just I don't mind taking it either way personally. Like I guess it depends on how I'm in the mood or whatever I think about the ending. But I do like leaving that completely open. Answering that in a really roundabout, scenic route way, my thoughts kind of on it are, well, I guess the best way I can kind of explain it. So I was watching a documentary recently while I was visiting my. It was about the Kennedys, and it was about all of these people, this dynasty of like, because I'm Canadian, so I don't really deal with America.
Same.
So it was interesting to get this like historical view on all of the like good and bad and everything that went along with these people, and how in how many cases you had people of influence and power, and not to say that Otis is in power, but they had great ambitions and great deeds that they wanted to accomplish and they had started on, and in some cases they had actually accomplished, or at least had gotten enough momentum behind. But in almost every situation, they like someone had just like something or someone had just snuffed them out, either assassinations or an accident in a plane or so on. It just reminded me of this dumb joke from Blown High. Nothing ever bad happens to a Kennedy. And and it as in terms of like storytelling, I think that's just something that I was trying to tap into. Not to say that like Otis is alive or dead or whatever, but like that complexity of life going somewhere and then things stopping where they maybe you don't want them to stop, and then someone else having to start up, or and so on. That that was really interesting to see that play out. Like someone could have played game, done a whole Game of Thrones thing where someone is always dying. But to actually see the complexity of great deeds and great movements coming to a complete halt and then having to be reignited by someone else, or just how life is just bizarre. I just thought that was really interesting, and that's something that I've kind of thought about quite a bit while writing, is just how to make some stranger than fiction. like feel convincing and so on, and how to get people thinking. Because I think, not to keep railing on the whole Kennedy thing, but I mean, the I understand why people were so obsessed with like the magic bullet and all of these other conspiracy theories after seeing more of the context of like the Kennedys. I understand why people would be so like distraught and looking for answers and looking for something to explain or to deal with however they took um, such big events coming to an end. So it's just, I don't know, that just kind of interests me, and I think that theme, those ideas, carry over to writing OwlBoy and other projects we're working on.
Yeah, my takeaway, I guess, was it's probably going to be more bittersweet, but if you find those discs, that leaves open because there's the paradox in the acquisition of the final disc and being able to actually use it. And they mention that paradox.
Yeah, the speedrunners call it laser skip. For anyone who's played the game, you probably go like, "What's that?" And then, well, there is only one like big laser that you can't skip. Yeah, the dumb joke of the speedrunning community.
Dig it. But yeah, that resolves all the narrative stuff. So just, is there any content updates or features you may be considering implementing for OwlBoy in the future?
I'm gonna say for now, probably not. We are very much just kind of done. We're just kind of doing bug support, community support. It's come up a lot where we think, hey, is this worth our time? Is this worth investing in again? And like we still, we really want, like, that was the hardest thing, was to release the game and to stop working, to be like, no, we're done. Um, and talking to other developers who have similar things, where it's just like, the game has been done for a year or two, and it's just like they just need to walk away from it. As much as it would be nice to be in that comfy place of working on something familiar with, you have to work on other things. You have to work on something new. Um, so it may be disappointing to people who want more, but it's not ruled out. It's just that we need a break from it. After like almost 10 years of working on that game, it's nice to be able to not think about it. Like, to not wake up in the morning and go, oh yeah, I got to do this OwlBoy thing again. Or like whenever you've got free time, think, oh yeah, I need to work on this OwlBoy thing again. Um, it's almost an unhealthy relationship with the project when it is in every aspect of your time.
So, in that regards, then, and I do believe you actually mentioned this, so any new projects planned on the horizon, and would you be willing to even provide some loose details?
Well, we've always had Vikings on trampolines just kind of like sitting there on the website. We've been doing that. We've been touring a little bit with that, or at least the guys in Norway have been touring with it a little bit. We've done a lot of play testing with it. It's just, it's always been on the back burner. So that interesting project is coming along, and we're making some good progress on that. We've got a number of like short to small term projects. We've got a really large one we've been planning out. I don't really have a time frame on when we'll actually have an announcement for that. It's just that there, with the game as big as OwlBoy, it has more or less consumed our free time even after it was done. Business stuff and marketing, community support, bug fixing, contracts for other platforms, porting, everything to do with after the fact that you don't really think about as a developer, especially when a game gets really big. Like when it goes really far, then you have to keep running with it. If it was a game that kind of like came out and did its thing and it was done in a month, like most games, then we would probably be on to other projects a lot faster. But we're a small team keeping up with a project that outgrew us.
Fair enough. So, is there anything you want to share with the audience or words you may have for aspiring devs?
Be used to failing. Be used to hitting dead ends constantly. Failure is not a problem. Like, failure is just another place to start. It's like, for games in general, you're going to have to wear a lot of hats. for anyone who is going to school for gaming, don't just do it when you're on school grounds. Do it in your free time. Like, you have to love what you're doing, and that's the same with any like artistic passion. If you're going to do writing, if you're going to do drawing, music, whatever, it has to be a thing that you want to do. Like, you need to be like kicking the door down when you come home to like pick up that instrument or pick up that paper and get to. Just like that passion needs to be there, and being mindful of where, not just where passion fails, but like where, your skills are, and always trying to improve them and learning. It's like anything, it just kind of has to be, more than a hobby. And not to say that it should ever be an unhealthy hobby. You should always like be mindful of when it's going too far and it's consumed all your time and you don't have a life anymore. You should always learn when to put the brakes on it. And that takes experience, that takes failures, not just failure of project, that takes failure of personal time, failure of like, not to say that, oh, you would be like screwing around with like social connection, like, the people who back out of everything, but it can put you in a hole when you focus too hard on something like a passion project. It can put you in a hole,
allowing it to consume you.
Yes, it can consume your time, it can consume your resources. You will potentially put aside resources like money, gathering, and so on for this project that you're so passionate about, and it can be something you're gambling with. Oh, well, if this works out, then long term I'll have this. And you should always have something to cover your bases in time. Like, you should always have your day to day operating well and covered well, and make room for your passions until they can pay for themselves.
I'd say that's pretty good advice that applies to a lot of things.
Yeah. It's a lot of people get burnt out by doing the thing that they think they love, and then they hate it, and then they forget you should always love the process of doing that. That's something I picked up from my buddy at Accessible Comics. Plug for them. They make a thing called Steve Lichman. It's a great comic, but they always give the advice of, you need to be in love with the process of drawing in order to continue it, to do it, to stick with it.
So lastly here, are there any indie projects that you'd like to introduce to the audience? Stuff you're following?
I think you guys should go check out Blazing Chrome by Joy Masher. That looks like a really fun Contra game. What else? A lot of my friends have finished stuff. Heartforth Alicia by Alonso Martin is coming along. That's also like a really cool game.
All right, so I'd just like to first off thank you for actually for showing up on the show today and providing a chunk of your time despite being really busy with everything.
Yeah, no problem.
Super appreciated. And also a thank you to you folks who are currently watching today, and especially if you're here from the OwlBoy community. Beyond that, you can buy Wishless OwlBoy on Steam. For news, there's a Twitter of @DPad Studio, as well as @Adrian Bauer on Twitter. Plus, there's a pair of spiffy websites in the form of www.dpadstudio.com and www.owlboygame.com that you can basically check out with links in the video description. Is there anywhere else you'd care to send people?
No, I think that's everything. There's a lot of cool video sites, and so a lot of cool video producers and people who make games and so on. It's just, I don't know, go digging through what other people like and find something that perks your fancy.
Alright, so to you folks who have tuned in, I highly appreciate. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and comment. I always try and get back to the people who comment. And if you'd like to see more content like this, if you hit the subscribe button and the little bell, you'll get notices when we post new videos. In the meantime, I will catch you folks next time. And seriously, thanks again for showing up on this.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me.